Welcome back to Myth Vision Podcast. I'm your host, Derek Lambert. The Gospel of Matthew. Is the guy a Jew? Is the guy a Gentile? Is it pro-Jewish? Is it anti-Jewish? Is it internal struggles amongst Jews? What is this guy doing when he quotes scripture, taking it out of context, or is he using it in context? Well, Dr. Bart D. Ehrman has a course on Matthew, and we're going to talk about a few things teasing you today that I hope intrigue you or pique your curiosity to get that course. Welcome back, Dr. Ehrman.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. So tease us, if you will, before I ask you a few questions about Matthew, what this course is about and why should people sign up for it?
Well, Matthew is it's the most frequently read book of the New Testament. So it's an important book, and historically, it's always been one of the most cited books of the entire New Testament. Mainly because I think the ethical teachings of Jesus in it resonate with people. You have the Sermon on the Mount, and you got the Beatitudes, blessed are the poor in spirit. You have the antitheses. You've heard it said, don't murder. I say, don't get angry. It has the Lord's Prayer. It has the Golden Rule. It has all of this stuff in it that you associate with Jesus, and it's principally in Matthew. So it's a really important book, but it's also really interesting in part because people don't understand it. They don't know they don't understand it, but I try to show. So a lot of my course is trying to unpack what I call, the title is called The Genius of Matthew, because I think, even though I'm not myself a Christian believer, but there's a lot of genius in this book, and people overlook it, I think, because of the way they read it. And I try to teach a different way of reading it that can enlighten the book in ways that people wouldn't expect.
I look forward to it, and I hope that everybody signs up. If you do so in the description, it helps us here at Myth Vision, so I really appreciate you doing that. Dr. Ehrman, I've had questions about Matthew, its use of Mark and such. I don't want to get overly technical with you because I got to keep in good with you. There's been times I've done interviews, we went lost in the weeds, and you felt like I was doing a PhD dissertation.
Oh, look, I don't mind it.
It's a simple thing.
I never mind going deep in the weeds. I'm not sure the listeners want to get down deep into it. Okay. All right. Okay.
Believe it or not, they love it. They love it. They love listening to what you have to say. You're a hero in many people's eyes in terms of just getting information out there that's kind of been there for a long time, but not many have heard about it. So I want to ask you your opinions along the way and whatever you're willing to tease us with without giving away the course in case you do cover some of this. In Matthew 7, he talks about many people who are acting like they're followers of Christ. And then he gives this punchline about, in that day, many of you will come to me and say, I did this in your name, I did that in your name. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. I have heard it said that some interpret this as Paul, that Matthew is jabbing at Pauline, lawless kind of Christians. I imagine it might matter when you date Matthew, but then again, that's decades after Paul, no matter how you date it. And it could be wrestling with how people then understand Paul, especially if you kind of see him heading in a direction that's against law or further in that way. What are your thoughts? What do you think's going on there in Matthew 7?
It certainly could be Paul or Pauline Christians. Matthew has a very strong emphasis that it is important not to neglect the Jewish law. So the passage you're quoting is near the end of the Sermon on the Mount, chapter 7, and Sermon on the Mount begins in chapter 5. And fairly early in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says that you shouldn't think that he came to destroy the law. He came to fulfill it. So he doesn't annul it. He fulfills it. And then he says that his followers need to keep the law, the Jewish law, better than the scribes and Pharisees. And if anyone doesn't keep the least of these commandments, they'll be called least in the kingdom. And so that would be Matthew 5:19. And some people think he's referring to Paul there, who's saying, look, you don't have to be circumcised. You don't need to do this, that, or the other thing. And so it doesn't matter. And maybe Matthew's targeting him. And it's possible that the same person then or the same group of people, that maybe Gentiles who don't think the law is important anymore, would be the ones who are being talked about as lawless in chapter 7, who are excluded because they say they believe in Jesus, but they accept him as Lord, but he doesn't know them. I'm not convinced that it's really just about Paul, especially that thing in chapter 7, because it talked about all of the things we've done in your name. And, Paul, there's not really much record of Paul going around like casting out demons and stuff in the name of Jesus. And so, it could be just anybody really who's not in Matthew's community who takes a view or takes a stand that Matthew doesn't agree with. And you say, yeah, you're going to be cast out.
So thank you for answering that. Let's dive into apocalypticism. I love the topic. It was one of the last stands for me when I was a fundamentalist. I moved into a heretical group called Full Preterist. We've discussed this in the past. I call it heretical because, most Christians don't think Jesus came back in 70 AD. So in Matthew, you've got this weird passage in Matthew 10 where he talks about, and I'll just quote it here from the NIV, brother will betray brother to death. And a father, this is verse 21 in chapter 10, and a father his child, children will rebel against their parents and have them put to death. You will be hated by everyone because of me, but the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. When you are persecuted in one place, flee to another. Truly I tell you, you will not finish going through the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. I interpret this as something that was expected that never happened, that was not fulfilled. It looks like a fossil, so to speak, of an earlier idea that may come from the actual, I guess, an earlier gospel, I would say maybe Q, or an earlier source. Does this look like failed apocalyptic expectations to you?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, he's talking to his disciples, and he's talking about how they're going to be persecuted, right? And so they're going to be dragged in from governors and kings, and they're going to they have to bear testimony to non-Jews. And so he's talking about, it's a little bit weird because earlier in that, I can't remember if you quoted this part, but in verse 18 where it says you're going to be dragged before Gentiles, but then he says you won't go through all the towns of Israel before before the Son of Man comes. And so it looks like there's maybe been different things spliced together here, maybe different sayings spliced together. The idea seems to be the disciples are going to go out and preach throughout the towns of Israel, and before they're finished, the end will have come. I'll say, you probably know this, but this was a key verse for Albert Schweitzer in his quest of the historical Jesus, because he said it goes back to Jesus. Jesus really said this verse, and he really did expect that the Son of Man would arrive before evangelism of Israel had finished. But then the disciples returned to Jesus, and the Son of Man had not arrived. That is what made Jesus decide that he himself had to suffer the messianic woes. For Schweitzer, that's why Jesus decided to go to the cross, because that would force God's hand. And so it's a key verse for Schweitzer. But he also understands it as a failed apocalyptic expectation. And I think that's probably right. I think it probably does go back to Jesus, or close to his time anyway, and that's a prediction that didn't happen.
And is it safe to say in this context, you're understanding Son of Man to be a different entity than Jesus himself?
Well, yeah, and I think he is. I mean, I think when he says this, it doesn't make any sense for Jesus to say, before you've gone through all the towns of Israel, I will come. So when Jesus talks about the coming of the Son of Man in the Gospels, in Matthew and Mark especially, but also in Luke and Q material and stuff, when he talks about the Son of Man in a variety of ways in the Gospels, sometimes he's just talking about himself. The Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. Sometimes he's talking about how he's going to suffer. The Son of Man must go to Jerusalem and be rejected and be executed. But sometimes, and in those cases, he's clearly talking about himself. But in the Gospels, sometimes he talks about a figure coming from heaven, and almost certainly based on passage in Daniel chapter 7. And in those passages, there's nothing to suggest he's talking about himself. And so if you didn't already think he was talking about himself, you would never imagine that. And so when you read this, if you just read this, there's nothing in this passage to make you think he's talking about himself, and it makes no sense if he's talking about himself. And so that's why the historical Jesus probably was referring to somebody other than himself as the cosmic judge, and that this is a reflection of that.
I was reading an article that John Collins sent me. He hadn't published yet. I don't know if he's published it since, but I would imagine it's somewhere online, where he's actually critiquing N.T. Wright's understanding of Mark. Now, I know we're dealing with Matthew, but this is an interesting point on how Matthew's dealing with this apocalyptic stuff later on in his gospel. He pretty much has this interesting passage that we're wondering if whoever wrote Mark actually wrote this, or if someone inserted it after the failed apocalypse never happened. And that is, well, not even the angel, not even the Son of Man. Well, he has this it's all about to happen, and then all of a sudden pump the brakes out of nowhere in mid, thrust of it's about to happen. And then you got to go, well, just keep in mind, it's getting Jesus off the hook. How Matthew deals with this, do you see anything that is unique apocalyptic wise in Matthew's gospel as he's dealing with Mark's, I'll call it synoptic apocalypse, but what do you think?
Well, Mark's synoptic apocalypse is chapter 13 of Mark. A lot of people don't realize that Mark doesn't have a lot of teaching of Jesus in comparison with Matthew or Luke or John. There are two main blocks of teaching in Mark. One is in chapter 4, where he tells some of his parables, and one is chapter 13, which is an apocalyptic discourse. And Matthew riffs on it. Matthew has a pretty similar apocalyptic view to Mark's. Matthew's apocalyptic discourse is 2 chapters. He doubles it, and he's got a lot more stuff in there. But it's all pretty much, the end's coming and you need to be ready and you need to be prepared. And Matthew does presuppose that the end is coming after Jesus takes off, because you have these parables about, for example, people being given certain amounts of money while their master's away and they're supposed to invest their money. One of them just kind of takes it and hides it in his mattress. And when the master comes back, he's all ticked off because he didn't invest his money. And clearly this is about Jesus leaving and coming back and expecting you to have done something in his absence. And so, so Matthew's presupposing a post-Easter, as they say, situation, even more than Mark is. But he doesn't lessen the apocalyptic message at all. He heightens it, in contrast to Luke, who softens the apocalyptic message, and John, who gets rid of it.
I love that progressive idea where you finally get to realize stuff. And I really appreciate you taking that moment to kind of emphasize that, because I definitely see Matthew. I almost feel like it's the most apocalyptic sounding out of the 3 synoptics. And of course, John's its own animal to tackle.
There's a reason for it too, why he's more apocalyptic. Is because he's got all of Mark's apocalyptic stuff, but he also has Q, which has apocalyptic stuff in it, and his M source has apocalyptic stuff in it. And so if Matthew was using, these, we don't know what M was. It could be a collection of sources. It could have been oral sources or written sources or both or whatever, but he's got special stuff. And when you've got 3 sources that are earlier than you, that are all apocalyptic, you're going to look more apocalyptic than just Mark is, which, doesn't have these other sources.
Well, one might push back and go, but Luke's using these things too, and his isn't as apocalyptic.
Well, he is and he isn't. He is and he isn't. He's not using M. He's got L material, which is non-apocalyptic, and he himself just doesn't have an apocalyptic view, so he tempers it. He still has Jesus predicting, that the end's going to come, and all that. So it's still apocalyptic, but it's very much muted. Not very much. It's muted in Luke, whereas it's heightened in Matthew.
One of the big ones that always got me, and I'd love to get your comments, is talking about Jesus is saying this to his disciples. So again, like your book on Revelation, highly recommend, if you haven't read or listened to it on Audible, get the book on Revelation by Dr. Bart Ehrman. It's fantastic. It deals right out the gate with this whole, who is the context? Who is this being written to? We need to deal with that. So then Jesus says to his disciples, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world? We've heard this quoted a million times. Yet forfeit their soul. Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? For the Son of Man is going to come in his Father's glory with his angels, and then he will reward each person according to what they have done. Truly I tell you, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. What does that mean to you as a scholar?
I think part of this Jesus could not have said. So, the problem again is, you have this entire passage that's stringing together various sayings. And what scholars do, every scholar who works on this stuff does, is figure out, if you've got an extended saying like that, are there parts of it that come from different sources? Are they representing different things? Part of this is clearly post-Easter, because when he says you have to take up your cross and follow me, that presupposes that Jesus has taken up his cross. And so it's written after, so that part comes after. But the idea that some of you standing here won't taste death before they see that the kingdom of God has come in power, the Son of Man has come, depending on which gospel you read. I think that is historical. That's something that goes back to Jesus, and that he really expected the cosmic judge of the earth to arrive within his generation. This generation won't pass away before all these things take place. I think that really does go back to Jesus. And that's, this isn't just kind of my crazy idea, of course. This is the common view among historical scholars. It's been the most common view since Schweitzer. Tom Wright doesn't like it very well. And, a lot of the Jesus seminar people don't like it very well, but it is the
I've heard several kind of what you dealt with Paulogia earlier. Rationalizations are trying to wiggle out of this what it means by the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. And they'll go to like Luke to say the kingdom is in you, and or some try to say it's transfiguration, which doesn't make sense because some of you die. Nobody died by the time the transfiguration scene is there. Then they try to go to Acts 1 and say it's the early church at Pentecost. And there's several trying to wiggle out of this problem and explain what's going on. But in your eyes, based on all the research you've done, this is clearly the end, and it doesn't this is the judgment and the reward to the righteous, correct?
I think so. Yeah. Yeah. No, look, when I went through phases of thinking all those things too. It's the transfiguration, it's the destruction of Jerusalem, it's, Pentecost, but they really don't work. And when you just actually look at them closely, they just don't work. And you put Jesus in his own context, and in the context of apocalyptic movements throughout Judaism, apocalyptic Jews such as those at the Dead Sea Scroll community, which also expected it to come very soon. Even Pharisees were apocalyptic. John the Baptist was apocalyptic. These people were expecting the end to come soon. And there's no reason to think Jesus was like radically different in that sense. He was different in other ways. But, it's pretty clear, I think, that a lot of these sayings do go back straight to Jesus. And I'll emphasize that you have these sayings on multiple levels of the tradition. So it isn't like everybody's getting it from Mark or something, which sometimes it seems like Jesus seminar people will say something like that. It's like, well, Mark is the only one. No. It's in M. It's in Q. It's like you go throughout the tradition. And so I think that's good evidence that Jesus probably said stuff like that.
Would you also be in line with where I'm going in my thinking? I'm reading John 21, which looks tacked on. It's a late in the day thing tacked on to the Gospel of John. And, Peter, do you love me? Peter, do you love me? Peter, do you love me? And then here's how you're going to die, buddy. And hey, what about this guy? That's not fair. And then he goes on to say, well, if it be my will that he remain, what is that to you? Until I come, what is that to you? And then the author goes out of his way to make you, the reader, realize there was this rumor that said that this beloved disciple would not die before Jesus comes back. Don't you think this is trying to fix Jesus's words in the earlier tradition? Some of you will not die before the Son of Man comes, and they're now understanding that he's supposed to be the one who comes and that some of the disciples are supposed to be alive. What are your thoughts?
I've never taken John 21 quite like that. The way I've usually taken it is that there's a rumor that the beloved disciple won't die, and then he did die. And people wondered, well, Jesus said he wouldn't die. And so they added this bit. I didn't say he wouldn't die. I said, what if he, I gave you a what if. I was giving you a hypothetical. I wasn't saying he wasn't going to die. And so they put that in to explain the fact that it seemed like he said he wasn't going to die, but then he did die. And so it's interesting to think about that in relationship to some of you standing here won't taste death. I would need to think about that. John himself, I think, doesn't have this strong apocalyptic view. And he has a few passages that kind of seem like remnants of it, or I forgot what term you used earlier. You had some kind of nice term for a fragment of something that shows up later. But my colleague Hugo Mendez is writing a book on the Johannine literature, and he thinks that there's no apocalyptic stuff in John at all. And and so he thinks even like this stuff about those who are in the tombs will be rising up when they hear the voice. He thinks, it's really not apocalyptic.
Can you tease us about the authorship as we exit this interview? And that is, I have heard it said that the author was the most Jewish, but then I've heard it said by some, and that it seems to be very Hellenistic in many ways, and its philosophy seems to be leaning in many ways. People might think the author might not be Jewish. I know you don't want to give the answer away, but can you at least tease us?
I think there are reasons to go both ways. So, I definitely don't think the author was Matthew the tax collector. And I explain, I have a full lecture on why it's not Matthew the tax collector and what we can say about the author. Everybody says, well, look, tax collectors had to be literate, right? Yeah, no. You had to be able to count money. And so I talk about all that kind of thing. But then I do talk at some length about what we can say about this this person and his relationship to Judaism, because in some ways that's the key to understanding Matthew's gospel, because many people will say it's the most Jewish gospel, and many people say it's the most anti-Jewish gospel. And so I have a lecture on Matthew is the anti-Jewish Jewish gospel. How can the most Jewish gospel be the most anti-Jewish at the same time? And in some ways it is. And understanding how that works is a key to understanding what Matthew is all about. In Matthew, Jesus insists that his followers keep the law. He doesn't come to abolish the law. He comes to fulfill the law, and everyone, his followers, have to keep the law better than the scribes and Pharisees. And if anyone lets the least of these commandments go by without keeping them, they'll be least in the kingdom of heaven. And it's like, whoa. And later, a verse that nobody pays attention to, in chapter 23, right before Jesus starts lambasting the scribes and Pharisees, which he repeatedly just blasts away at them for their hypocrisy, he starts out by saying, scribes and Pharisees sit on Moses' seat, and so you should do everything they teach, but don't do what they themselves do. Matthew 23:3. Boy, people miss that one. You're supposed to do what the Pharisees tell you to do. The problem with the Pharisees isn't that they tell you the wrong stuff. They don't do it themselves. That's the problem. Whoa, what? Can he mean what? And so there's a lot of stuff in Matthew where you just scratch your head and say, can he mean that? And throughout my course, I tried to show, yeah, he meant it, and I tried to show what he meant by it.
The last comment, if I could sneak this one, is the moment the curtain of the temple was torn from top to bottom, the earth shook, rocks split, tombs broke open, bodies of men, holy people who had died were raised to life. They came out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection, went into the holy city, appeared to many. I've heard it said, I don't know if you have a position on this, but I've heard it said that even in like Paul's First Corinthians, the 500 saw him, this and that. This early tradition, as we've been talking about going back to Jesus, that maybe he did say that some of them would not die till the Son of Man came. And there's this idea of the dead being raised, which is coupled with that Son of Man coming and returning, as we see 1 Thessalonians 4, which your book of Revelation talks about some of this stuff. And do you think that he's trying to somehow also, while there's apocalypticism there, he fabricates this data to have it kind of complement his apocalyptic expectations?
Yeah, it's hard to know how to work it out, what he's doing there, because it is unique to Matthew. And people most frequently talk about the zombies coming out of the tombs and kind of thing, walking around Jerusalem. And so, for understandable reasons, it's kind of peculiar and fascinating in its way. I think it clearly is trying to show that at the death of Jesus, an apocalyptic moment has occurred and that the apocalypse in some way has begun. I think that this is not unusual within the New Testament. I think Paul thinks the apocalyptic moment starts with the crucifixion. I think Mark thinks that the apocalypse has started in some sense, and that in some ways the kingdom has started to arrive, and that it's going to arrive in a big way when the Son of Man comes. So I think Mark, Matthew, and Paul all agree on that. But in this story in particular, even more than anywhere in Mark or in Paul, you get this very real sense that the apocalypse has started with these apocalyptic events occurring, including a resurrection, but also, the whole chaos. Chaos is hitting, earthquakes and rock splitting and all this stuff. So, oh my God, the world is ending, and in a sense, it has started to end with the crucifixion of Jesus. And so that becomes, in the early decades of Christianity, one of the standard views, that it started with the death of Jesus, and now it's soon to end. The problem, of course, is the soon has to get dragged out. By the time Matthew's writing, in some ways it's remarkable that he does this, 50 years later. He's still thinking it's begun and it's going to end soon. But, then later on, people start saying, yeah, probably not going to end soon.
Wow. Sounds like not a very good ending coming for those who are non-believers or those who are unrighteous. That morality of apocalypticism is kind of a scary thing to consider. Dr. Ehrman, I really look forward to this course. People need to sign up. Any teasers, any outros, anything you'd like to say before we go?
Well, there's a lot of stuff in this course that people would not have thought of before. I will say that, and including this is a smart book, and there were smart in people in the Gospel of Matthew, including one of my things in this is I show how the story of the Magi coming to Jesus foreshadows the entire themes of the Gospel of Matthew. People just think of it as kind of an interesting Christmas story, right? Okay, the wise men show what follows. I show, yeah, actually, this is Matthew in a nutshell, and I show why. So like I got stuff like that in there, and people wouldn't expect. So, yeah, this course was a lot of fun, and it takes seriously the historical study of Matthew, especially in relationship to one of its sources, Mark. And it shows how Matthew changed things in Mark and added tons of stuff to Mark, and how you can interpret the gospel in light of how it changed Mark. And it takes quite seriously the fact there are contradictions between Matthew and Mark, but also there are expansions of Markan themes and developments of new themes. And you got to study it closely, or you're not going to understand it. If you simply think it's just another retelling of Jesus' story, you're kind of missing the plot.
Thank you, Dr. Bart D. Ehrman. Sign up today.